Good morning. Towards the end of my paper, for people who struggled their way all the way to the end, there's a quote from the Ramban, from Nachmanides, the great Spanish Kabbalist and Talmudist, from his book Torat Hashem Tamima, in which he says, and I almost fell off my chair when I read this, that people who deny the existence of demons are cruel. And he does this in the context of a critique of Aristotle and presumably in some veiled way of Maimonides. He says, from this you will see the cruelty of the leader of the philosophers and his hardness. May his name be erased. For he denies a number of things that many have seen and we have seen their truth. And what are those things? And in olden times, as in the days of Moses, they were known to all. For the arts in that generation were all spiritual, like the matters of the demons and sorcerers and the varieties of offerings to the host of heavens. And when the Greeks arose, this notorious man arose and only believed in the sensuous, and sought sensuous arts, and denied the spiritual things, and denied, and said that demons and acts of sorcery were nullities. Okay, so my talk today really is, what is going on? Why would the Ramban say that to deny the existence of demons and sorcery is cruel? And he comes very close, in fact, more or less explicitly says that denial of demons and denial of God is almost the same thing. How did that ever happen? What does he mean by the word cruelty, aghzariyut? As far as I can tell in the Ramban's work, this aghzariyut means cruelty in the usual way, and I haven't found any other usage of that term. Okay, so that's really what I want to put on the table. Why the denial of the demonic is cruel. What's cruel about it? Okay. So now I'm going to begin again. I'm going to begin this talk where Philip left us yesterday. And Philip left us yesterday with a quote from Max Weber that goes like this. In Baxter's view, Baxter is this 16th century Protestant theologian. In Baxter's view, the care for external goods should only lie on the shoulders of the saint like a light cloak, which can be thrown aside at any moment. But fate decreed that the cloak should become an iron cage. Philip read us that quote yesterday. This idea that something is hanging on us like an iron cage. Now, it turns out in the German, and as I'm sure Philip knows, a more literal translation of the term iron cage would be a shell as hard as steel. A shell as hard as steel. And anyone who's ever walked, forget about studying Kabbalah, if you ever walked past a bookshelf that contained Kabbalistic books, you're automatically twitching. This is a klipa. A klipa is a shell that covers you, right? And that prevents you from living, that dominates you. It's something that should be able to be thrown off like a light cloak, but it dominates you. It imprisons you, okay? And what's inside that shell, Philip told us? A nullity, a nullity. These people, these sensualists without spirit, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, okay? And Philip really left us with a call for revitalizing society, getting out of the iron cage through presumably the title of this conference, Spirituality, Jewish Spirituality, and Social Transformation. The idea that spirituality can somehow break the iron cage, can break the klipa, to use the Kabbalistic term that it turns out that Weber was a student of the Zohar. That's a little known fact. Okay, so what is this thing? Okay, what is this power that can break the klipa? Okay, now what I want to say here is that this power that can break the klipa is some kind of life force, some kind of wild force, right, that precedes form and that is able to take a number of different forms. It can take monstrous forms, klipa forms, or it can take divine forms. But that this kind of wild force is somehow the primordial reality. And when I say this, I'm speaking as a person of my era, someone who's very influenced by modernism, the early 20th century culture, out of which comes, among other things, the academic study of Kabbalah, and also my other field, which is modern international law. Now, this idea that this force of spirituality can break reified forms is a very common trope all over early 20th century culture, and specifically about religion. And to add to the spiritual but not religious origins, we have a Central European thinking, Central and Western European thinking about religion at this time that uses those kinds of tropes a lot. So in Simmel, for example, German sociologist, you have this idea of the opposition between religiosity and religion. It's basically the same thing that Bill was talking about. This then is adopted by Martin Buber, who you may have heard of. In France, you have Georges Bataille talking about the difference between the left sacred and the right sacred, in which the left sacred is this churning force, and the right sacred is basically institutionalized religion. You have the great the Swiss Protestant theologian Karl Barth talking about the opposition between grace and religion, really sort of a radicalization of some Pauline theses. And then closer to maybe most of our homes, we have Shalom, Gershom Shalom, who in a famous essay in 1945 talked about the demonic giant of Jewish history filled with explosive power, composed of vitality, evil, and perfection. And he felt that the sin of the 19th century science of Judaism, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, was to reduce that demonic giant filled with vitality, evil, and perfection into some kind of bourgeois, stunted, good citizen, some kind of paterfamilias, boring thing. And part of Shalom's project, I assume, in my own reading of it, was this quintessential avant-garde project of reviving the demonic giant and breaking the klipa of bourgeois mediocrity that he rebelled against as a young man. Okay. Talk 2. A brief detour into international law. Now, the reason I'm doing this is partly because that's my other disciplinary hat, but in part because these themes are intimately connected for us. They were intimately connected for Shalom, and so forth. In international law, the thing that happens in the early 20th century is a radical shift in the understanding of the relationship between states, countries, in other words, a state in international law speak as a country, a state, an independent country, and nations, in other words, the people or peoples or nations who the states are supposed to represent. In the 19th century, the idea was peoples, nations, in other words, claims for self-determination of peoples, to use a modern term, were viewed as not legal. And in fact, the idea was that to allow nationalist claims into international law, claims for self-determination, would destroy international law. And I quote this guy named, who I'm sure you all know, Guido Padaletti, who was a very prominent Italian international lawyer in the late 19th century, died tragically young. He said, if we substitute the concrete idea of the state to the notion, vague, filled with contradictions and misunderstandings of the nation, it would be the dissolution of all political ties and lead to utter chaos in international affairs. Okay? But at the same time, this thing that would dissolve everything and lead to chaos, at the same time, it turns out, weirdly enough, it would also lead to the formation of 3 or 4 monstrous states. So the thing that dissolves everything also leads to the reification of these huge monstrous states, right? That the existing states would have no longer be legitimate because they weren't reflecting nations. There'd be 3 or 4 monstrous states, and the ultimate danger, he said, there would be pan-Slavism, pan-Germanism. Okay. Now, something that dissolves and yet produces monsters, something that's filled with contradictions, yet possessed of a logic which would bring about the worst consequences, that kind of paradox, as I say, is familiar to anyone who studies Kabbalah. It's very much a description of demonic forces in Kabbalah, things that break everything apart and yet somehow also produce monsters, produce the devil, produce Lilith, and so forth. Now, in what happens after World War I is that international lawyers say, you know what, these forces of nationalism are really important. They actually are the life force of international society, right? But they're also dangerous. An ambivalence. They're necessary, it's life itself, but also incredibly dangerous. Okay? And I have a long analysis of this guy, Robert Redslub, who really lays this out. He talks about nationalism as an elemental force, as an ardent torrent, and that international law has to really get in touch with it and give voice to those aspirations, but also has to discipline it and give it legal form. And in some detail in the paper, I talk about how the various legal solutions to the problem of nationalist conflict were meant to do this double thing. Give it form, give this life force form, but also restrain it or discipline it, to use Redslub's terminology. For Redslub, it's existing, it's not the states that would emerge out of nationalism which were monsters. It was existing states not nourished by the life force, were inorganic, lifeless entities. They were devoid of real personality, of ethnic personality, right? And they were therefore destructive, and that's why they had to be, again, put in touch with the life force, but also then law had to restrain it and give it form. And self-determination, minority protection, international guarantees, and all that were all methods of doing this, and I go through that in some detail. Okay. Let me now switch to Kabbalistic materials. Where am I in time? What? 8 minutes left? Okay. 8 minutes is enough time to do Kabbalah. Because I've really already done it. The term klipa, the shell, right, in Kabbalah is this, it's basically the normal state of the world is the rule of the klipa, right? And as I say in the paper, a lot of Kabbalistic myth could be understood as an ideological myth, a myth that's supposed to explain the current state of things by giving you some kind of origin story. How does it happen that our world, created by God, is ruled by the klipa, by the sitra achra, by the other side? Right? How does that happen? Right? How does it happen that the life force, right, of divine vitality is ruled by this thing which blocks it? And a lot of the myths are really about trying to do what's the backstory? How do we get here, right? Rabbi Shimon says, you know, I see all the nations are elevated and Israel is the lowest of all. How could that possibly have happened? Then he tells a story, and I talk about that in the paper. I'm not going to talk about it here, about the king who sends away his true consort and puts the bondwoman in her place as an ideological myth of how it happens that the what should be ruling is actually dominated, and what should be dominated is actually ruling. Now, there are a number of different stories, and a number doesn't begin to describe. There are a vast number of stories in the Zohar about where the klipa, where the sitra achra, the other side, the demonic side, comes from. Right? The one I want to focus on here, and see if I can do it in like 2 minutes, is this idea of the Tehom, the abyss which appears in the second verse of Genesis, right, as the prelude to God saying, "Let there be light," right? And there's some kind of mystery between the first verse, the second verse, and the third verse of Genesis. And so where this intervention of the Tehom and the darkness and the Tohu, where does that come from? And a lot of Kabbalah is sort of a reflection on the relationship between those three verses. And what is this Tehom? In the Zohar, in one passage, it talks about how the first act of creation, basically what's described in the third verse of Genesis, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. What precedes it is a battle between God and the ultimate klipa, the ultimate representative of the demonic, which is the Tanin HaGadol, the great dragon. And it goes on for pages about this mythic battle between God and the great dragon, his ultimate opponent. And he has to bash him in the head and defeat him, and it goes on for eons until somehow the light then can go into the abyss, because the dragon is over the abyss, covering it like a klipa. And when the light goes into the abyss, then the abyss takes form. There's an elaborate description about all the forms that gradually inform the abyss, and that is really the first the first creation. What is this great dragon? Well, there are other passages in the Zohar, and I can't really demonstrate it here, in which it seems quite clear that this great dragon is nothing other than a congealment of the Tehom. It's a congealment. It's somehow a perverse congealment of the Tehom, the very Tehom which is the first creation. Elsewhere in the Zohar, and the Zohar doesn't so much use this term, but it uses a different term, but it's also quite clear elsewhere in the Zohar that that God, the divine forms themselves, emerge out of the abyss. Now, the Zohar doesn't use the word Tehom to describe this emergence, it uses a different word, Tehiru, but in later Kabbalah, for example, in Cordovero, it's quite clear that the Tehom is also the name for the ultimate primordial thing out of which the divine forms emerge. So this primordial reality, the Tehom, the abyss, the deep waters, the overflowing, uncontrollable waters, is somehow capable of yielding demonic forms and divine forms from that same life force. Right? Borrowing from the work of scholars like Elliot Wolfson, and also from a passage in Yehuda Liebes, and insights that are really that are stated explicitly in the 18th century Sabbatean work Vavo Hayom El Ayin, right? I would say there are a number of places in the Zohar, right, in which it seems quite clear that the ultimate, that the demonic form, in seemingly pure evil form, Edom, Esav, the ultimate enemies of holiness of Israel, turn out to be perverse or premature or misshapen forms of the divine itself. And this is very explicitly stated in Vavo Yain, and there are a number of places in the Zohar in which it seems quite clear that Edom, for example, in the famous Passion of the Jarabah, who's sort of the ruler of this perverse order of kings, what might say a monstrous international order, is actually a perverse form or premature or misshapen form of Atika Kadisha himself, the Holy Ancient One, the ultimate name for the divine, or one of the ultimate names of the divine in the Zohar. That somehow this shift between orders, between a cosmic order ruled by the demonic, a monstrous one, and a cosmic or international order ruled by holiness, right, is part of the same process and mediated in a way by a return to the life force, a return to this gushing life force of the Tehom or the Tehiru. Okay, good. So I have 2 minutes left, and so there's a perfect time to say two things. First of all, spirituality and social transformation. Why do we need social transformation? Because our world is ruled by the klipa, right? What can set it going? In other words, the idea of going to spirituality, that some force is needed to get the thing going, to break open the reified forms, right? To shift from one order to another order, right? How? By using some kind of energy that can take good forms and bad forms. And if we're looking to religious energy, we all know that religious energy has produced some of the best things of which human beings are capable, and also some of the very, very worst things that human beings are capable. Religion can be divine, religion can be demonic. And this is why there is this paradox, I think, in Kabbalistic terminology about this Tehom or the Tehiru, in which it can appear in some texts as the highest, in some texts as lowest, as the source of the demonic, as source of the divine. And this is a good time to conclude with one of our key prophets. And when I say our, you'll hear when I tell you who the key prophet is, Nathan of Gaza. This is one of the epigraphs to my paper, and he says in his discourse on the dragons, Drusha Taninim, which is a commentary on that very Zoharic passage that I alluded to before, which I had the opportunity to learn in Chavrusa with Shaul. And he says this: why has the abyss remained in the world? In other words, why, after the second verse of Genesis, why is there still an abyss? Right? Why is that? Right? Okay? And this is what he says. The reason is that each time the Blessed Holy One works a great miracle, he sifts siftings from it. he's doing berur, borer berurin. And from this raw material, and the word here that he uses is golem, from this raw material come into being creations that the blessed God creates through his wonders. And this is the mystery of the abysses were congealed in the heart of the sea. Kaf'u tehomot belev yam. That's where miracles come from. That's where new creations come from. That's where social transformation comes from, by dipping into the abyss. And then he says, also the King Messiah has already sifted several times from it. And of course, for Nathan of Gaza, King Messiah is, of course, Shabtai Tzvi. So who engages with the abyss? The ultimate creators for Nathan of Gaza, which is God and Shabtai Tzvi, right? Now, we know that the history of Sabbateanism has produced amazing things and also some really terrible things, right? And why is it? Because it's that relationship to the abyss, that relationship to that life force, which can produce both the divine and the demonic. It can produce an international order which is monstrous. It can produce an international order which is vivified by the life force. And when we go to spirituality or social transformation, there's that danger. You can go both ways. And yet there's no alternative than to go to the life force. Thank you.